Anubis the Ride was the main coaster at Plopsaland de Panne before Ride to Happiness opened in 2021. I never really heard anyone talk about this Gerstlauer launch coaster, so I didn't know what to expect. I watched some POVs and it looked decent. To say this ride was a nice surprise is an understatement. But what do I really think of this coaster? This is my review of Anubis the Ride at Plopsaland de Panne. I rode this coaster back in January 2021 when I first went to Plopsaland de Panne, and I got a total of 11 rides on this coaster over the 2 days I was there. The ride was always a walk-on or a 1 or 2 cycle wait, so naturally I didn't spend too much time in the queue. The queue is entirely indoors in the building that is a recreation of the building from the show which this ride is themed to. Outttro's Anubis is a TV show that had a German adaptation named Das Haus Anubis, and I remember actually watching a few episodes of the show. The station building, which is as previously mentioned a recreation of the building from the show, is pretty close to the original but not quite the same. However, if you would just show me a picture of the station building, I would definitely recognize the building and think it's the real thing. It's not 100% accurate, there are just some minor details that are a bit different from the original. Now for the layout overview, I will once again give the word to past me from like 6 weeks ago.
Alright, so we roll out of the station and go down a right hand turn that goes into the launch, which is into a top hat, right hand descent into a dive loop which goes into another top hat, into an Immelman, and a turn into the mid-course left-hand descent which goes into a right-hand turn that ends in a hard-line roll, and then we go into the brake run. And that brings us back to the station.
Now that we have a basic overview of the layout, I will quickly talk about every part that I think needs to be talked about. First up is of course that launch. Before riding this, I thought Carajo was peak LSM launch intensity. There was no way there could be a launch more intense than that, at least an LSM launch. Well, I was proven wrong. To say this launch was forceful is an understatement. It's easily the most powerful launch I experienced yet. Is there even anything more to say about this launch? I think my reaction explains this launch pretty good. The top hat is really good since it provides a shockingly good ejector airtime pop on the top, but also really good forces on the pull-up. The pull-up however has some nasty jackhammering and you really feel that in every row, especially in the back. This really is the only rough part of the ride, however, everything else was glossy smooth during my rides. The drop down from the top hat also has some great laterals paired with some decent airtime. The dive loop has a little whip going into it, but it's not nearly as good as the dive loop on Carajo. While it may not be as whippy as Carajo's dive loop, it's a little bit more intense and you have quite a bit more speed. I actually blacked out on one of my rides and I only regained my vision when we dropped down from the second top hat. Speaking of the second top hat, it's quite an odd choice for an element, but I actually really like it. It delivers some great laterals paired with weak airtime, so this was definitely the most surprising element of the entire ride. The Immelman was not really that special, except it had some decent forces going into it. As Canopy Coaster said in his review,
"On ride, this element honestly feels like a giant overbank more than an inversion."
And I 100% agree with that statement. You turn up into the mid-course brake run which trimmed the car ever so slightly. This mid-course brake run, however, sadly marks the end of the good part. After the mid-course brake run, the ride drops down in a left-hand turn which has a little force but nothing crazy. The ride then goes over a twisted hill that doesn't provide any airtime. You just coast over it. This is really the only part of the layout which could be improved. A final right-hand turn follows which has once again some okay forces but nothing to scream about. This then leads into the final element of the ride, a hardline roll. This one gives some really nice hang time and it's definitely a great element to end the ride. Now, because the ride only has a car with 3 rows, there isn't really a huge difference in the force department. However, I would still recommend the front row on this coaster since the view is obviously better. But I also recommend it because the jackhammering on the pull-up of the top hat is the mildest in those seats. It's still very present, but it's by far the weakest. The ride uses the usual Gerstlauer seat and restraints that is present on other Gerstlauer Eurofighters. The seats are quite comfortable, but in the front row, seats feel a bit cramped since they are pretty close to each other and you barely have space. Now, the ride has over-the-shoulder restraints, but I don't really mind. Sure, I would have loved it if it had lap bars, but you can't have everything. The over-the-shoulder restraints are fine since the ride is pretty smooth, so you don't have to worry about headbanging. The airtime on the top hat is also so strong that the over-the-shoulder restraints don't matter. You can feel it regardless. I honestly don't have any complaints except what I already mentioned. The pull-up into the top hat would benefit from a retrack, because the jackhammering is really bad and I fear it could become even worse. Other than that, I also think the second half could have been executed a little bit better than it is now. Now that I talked about everything important, I just wanted to mention some other things that I noticed that don't fit within the other categories of this review. During my visit, they did 3 train operations on this coaster, even though 2 train operations would have been completely fine. After your ride, you always had to wait 1 train to cycle around the track to get out. They would always stack 1 train in the final block. You couldn't get out until the train in front of you was dispatched, so you always had to wait right about 1 cycle on the final block before your train could pull into the station. This is why 2 train operations would have actually been enough. The 3rd train was just unnecessary. But hey, I gotta give credit for not doing 1 train operations on these slower, rather empty days. So yeah, this is really everything I wanted to say about Anubis the Ride at Plopsaland de Panne. In conclusion, even though this coaster has these 2 flaws, it's still a good coaster that I think is criminally underrated. It has an insane launch and a super forceful and unique layout with some great elements. Just like Ride to Happiness, it also delivers a variety of sensation. Great forceful launch, awesome airtime, some good lateral forces but also some hang time and good positive forces. I expected this ride to be decent, but I didn't expect it to be this good. The setting in the woods is also really cool and the station building looks very true to the original, while the queue is also nicely decorated. The seats are also really comfortable and the restraints are fine like they are. If you enjoyed this review, make sure to leave a like to help me compete with the YouTube algorithm. And if you enjoy my content, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and activating the bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. Lastly, make sure to follow my Instagram for updates on my future videos and No Limits Tour projects, as well as updates on my future park visits. And with all that said and done, thank you all for watching. Swiss Coaster Enthusiast out.